Hi, I'm Tracie Grube Gaurkee, and I am here on behalf of the Sheboygan County Research Center at our second Saturdays at the beautiful Plymoth Arts Center. And I am here to speak on Wisconsin Sewer Socialists. I am currently a PhD student at Texas Christian University and an adjunct professor at Tarrant County College in Fort Worth, Texas.
We don't have any classes scheduled, and I don't have any history on the move scheduled because I need to get my life in order. So stay tuned. I'll have schedules soon. And I'm going to let Tracie introduce herself. Tracie's here with us this morning from Houston. She came home to visit her parents and to present to you. So here we go.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if we can do this. This is cool. Just because this might be a little bit easier. Can you all hear me? Okay. Like Katie said, I want to thank her first for allowing me to be here to speak to you all this morning. My name is Tracie Grube Gaurkee, and I was born and raised in Sheboygan. I lived in Milwaukee for quite a while, and now I am pursuing my PhD at Texas Christian University, and I'm an adjunct history professor at Tarrant County College in Fort Worth. So what I wanted to do with you today is talk about sewer socialism in Wisconsin, because it's a very important part of our state's history, and a lot of it actually happened in this county. So that's really where this all began. So one of my courses was a research course, and it was on American politics. And it was during COVID, so I was still in Milwaukee, and I started to think about my family's history. And there was always a story that we had a socialist in our family, and no one really knew who it was. We thought it was my great-granduncle, but when I started to do some research, I actually found out it was my great-great-grandfather, and that's him right there. That's Henry F. Grube. And he was a socialist in the city, and he also served the county. So that's, like I said, really where this idea to start researching this came from. And it's a labor of love, so it's still in progress. So you'll have to forgive me if I do miss some things here and there. But the research paper was called The Benefits of Activities by Reason. And that came from a resolution that was printed in the paper, put out by the county supervisors when Henry died in 1950. So that's really where all of this stems from. And to begin, I think it's really important to understand what socialism is, because when we think about it, it brings up different connotations, and it's really an economic and intellectual idea and a system. It's also existed for centuries. It traces its way all the way back to Greece, and Plato talked about it. So it's always been there. It was just not something that on a higher until we see the first industrial revolution of the 1820s, where we have people really pushing production, trying to do mass production, create more profit, and more people are moving into the urban areas. So rural areas, farming, and coming into industry. And people started to think about, well, we're making this profit, but what's happening to the workers? And that's really where socialism in the United States, and even in, obviously, that's where a lot of it started to come from. How do we make it better for the workers? And within the system, it was goal. Private property, you could still have private business, but to create a better system so the workers were no longer exploited. And ideologically, again, that's kind of the middle step socialism between capitalism and communism. So that's where socialism starts to evolve, and when the Russians, the Bolsheviks, have their revolution in 1917, 1918, that's where this Marxist, Leninist, communist ideology starts to take shape. And so here, this is really just kind of a way to show how communism and socialism differ. So we have the capitalism and property. So within communism, there's no private property. It's all owned by the state. It's all decided how economic and industrial resources are going to be distributed to the people. And socialism still allows for private property. So you're still able to have, your private industry, you own your own home, you own your own land, things like that. Again, communism, as we saw in Russia and in China, it's a revolutionary overthrow of the government. The government we had into communist ideology. And with socialism, a lot of it is changes through the established democratic means. So as we'll see that's exactly how the sewer socialists worked to make change within the state. They worked within this established democratic system that we have, the polls, constitution, and not taking this revolutionary means. Government, again, we have in communism a strong central government, and they allocate the resources. Socialism, citizens share equally in the economic resources, and they're allocated by a democratically elected government. So you still have a say. And then individual effort and innovation. In communism, the whole idea, like that first up there, is that in communism, workers are only going to work as hard as they need to survive. So if you have a quota, you're only going to work because you're not going to make any more money. You're not going to. It's there. Whereas socialism still allowed for that compensation through contribution. So if you push yourself a little bit harder, maybe you'll get that raise, or maybe you'll get that extra money through your work. And so going through that, we get to Eugene V. Debs and Victor Berger in the US. So a lot of the socialists started to come over from Germany, especially here we see with the 48ers. That's where it really started to happen, but it didn't really take full shape until about the 1890s. So we have, and that's where these two gentlemen come into play. So Victor Berger is, or was, should say, he is considered the co-founder of the Socialist Party of America, and he was a newspaperman. He ran the Milwaukee Leader. He acted socialist. So he came over from Austria-Hungary. He came over in the 1870s, settled in Milwaukee in 1881, and he really had this idea of, he followed a man by the name of Henry George, who was an American economist that advocated a single tax system. And while in Milwaukee, Berger had a debate with a Marxist, and Berger lost the debate. And after losing, he really started to get interested in this whole idea of Marxism. So he started as an ideological follower, but really started to see that that wasn't the right way to get to the end result. So he really sought to create a better society for the people of the state and the city. He wanted, sanitation, clean sewers, clean water, better power. And so with that, he really stepped back from the strict ideological side of it, moved more into this practical source of socialism. He was instrumental in turning Eugene V. Debs' Socialist. And Debs was kind of the nominee for president in the early 20th century. And he was a young man when he started on the rail line. He started a union, and by the time he was 20, he really began to create, it was called the American Railway Union, and it was meant to bring all rail workers under one umbrella. So instead of having a union for the locomotive, for the engineers, for those that are setting down the ties, you know, things like that, he wanted to bring everyone together so they could all fight for that equality. And he went ahead and started to do that, and he led a strike against the Great Northern Railway in 1894. And this was really just a struggle for higher wages, because again, this is what we refer to as the Gilded Age. So post-Civil War, pre-1900, you have this age of this rise of these massive capitalists, or as we call them, robber barons. J.P. Morgan, I'm blanking, Andrew Carnegie, that's who's, sorry. But they're really more concerned about increasing their wealth and increasing the profit that they see in their company, and not really concerned about their workers. And that's where the socialists really stepped in and wanted to better the lives of working people and to try to bring back the higher echelon of people within the nation, the robber barons and their wealth, bring that back down and match it up closer, working class up, so that way there was still the sense of a middle class. Because at this time, part of the argument that they were making was that the middle class was disappearing. And so, because of this, that's where Debs really stepped in. So they won that first strike. And then a few months later, the Chicago Pullman Palace Car Company, or the Pullman strike, and he was chosen to lead that. He didn't really want to. Had just come off of, yeah, we won, but he didn't think he had the notoriety. He didn't think that he had the means and the ability to actually win this next strike. And needless to say, he was correct. The Palace Car strike didn't go well. This was the first time in the United States that an injunction was actually put on a strike. So basically, the Palace Car strike disrupted all traffic in the Midwest. I mean, at that point, we were all, you know, trains. That's how you get all of your commodities. That's how you travel. And if you can't go anywhere, everybody's losing money. So at that time, Grover Cleveland, who was the president in Congress, instituted an injunction to say, hey, you need to go back to work. You know, we're going to make sure that we appease you as the labor unions. And this is where Labor Day actually comes from. So it was created as a way to give these workers a day off, also to try to bring both sides back to the bargaining table, because neither side really wanted to give anything, really. They wanted more money. The owner of the Pullman didn't want to give them the money. So once the strike continued after that injunction, Debs was arrested for one of the first times, and he was sentenced. So he was arrested on a conspiracy to kill and also contempt of court for violating that injunction. And he had the charge of conspiracy to kill of that, but he was sentenced to that 6 months for the contempt of court. And it was during the 6 months that he was in prison in Woodstock, Illinois, that Debs and Berger first meet. And there's a book, if you can find it, it's a very interesting read. It's Elmer Beck, and it's the Sewer Socialists of Wisconsin. And it was printed, I think the first time it was in the 70s. It's very hard to find, but if you can find it in a library, definitely worth the time. And he gives this really interesting story of how he met in prison. So I'm just going to quote him here because I couldn't say it any better. So, quote, "The story of Deb's conversion to socialism is somewhat a classic in socialist lore. He was in jail at Woodstock, Illinois in 1895. Berger visited him there. And pacing the corridor like the pro of a German professor, talked for hours spouting socialist theory." So he really was, he was doing what he did. Berger was a teacher, he loved to speak, and he went and talked to Debs because he knew, he understood that Debs was someone that they could bring into this fold and help them achieve their ultimate goals. And in a 1902 blurb from The Comrade, which was one of the many socialists at the time, Debs responded, his quote, "It was at this time when the first glimmerings of socialism were beginning to penetrate that Victor L. Berger, and I have loved him ever since, came to Woodstock as if a providential instrument and delivered the first impassioned message of socialism I'd ever heard, the very first to set to the wires humming in my system. As a souvenir of that visit, it is in my library a volume of Das Kapital by Karl Marx inscribed with the words of Victor Berger, which I cherish as a token of priceless value." So it's very clear, even from Deb's own words, that Berger made this huge impact on him and really started to push him towards this socialist idea. And it was from that these two men within Milwaukee came together and started to develop the Social Democracy of America Party. So it took a few years. We in Wisconsin had the Socialist Labor Party. There were in there, but no one ever really quite made the impact that the Social Democracy Party of America will within the United States. And this here, this is Handel Hall in Chicago. This is where the first meeting of the Socialist Party occurred. So it began in Chicago, Handel Hall, located at the corner of Randall Street and Wabash Avenue. And it was the middle of June. The delegates arrived to establish this new political party that sought to challenge both the Democrats, Republicans, and the Populists, who was another third party at the time that was gaining strength among the rural population of the U.S., and also known as the People's Party. And so I was elected president of this new party, and he went ahead and he, of course, like he did, delivered a fiery speech. So whenever you see like a picture of Robert La Follette, I mean, we all know who Bob La Follette is, Fighting Bob, yeah. When you see that picture of him and he's, pounding his fist, his hair's everywhere, you know he's impassioned. It's the same with Debs. Granted, he can't do it with the crazy hair, but he had that power and he had that oomph behind his speech that really got people into, following his belief. He was that charismatic leader that they needed. And so with that, he really pushed on the delegates that came to follow them in the socialist, as they called it, revolution. And it was going to take place through the system, but they wanted to really eliminate the wage system, and that was because they wanted to decrease the exploitation of workers at the time, which, like we said, Gilded Age, huge difference between the two sides. And So that happened, that began on June 15th, I apologize. The June 18th then, that's when all the delegates came together, because this conference lasted a good week, about a week, and it was at that time on June 18th that they decided on their new party name, which at the time was the Social Democracy of America Party. And they really brought together a lot of different groups. So they brought together like members of the Social Labor Party, the Labor Exchange, the Humanitarian League, all different kinds of people come under this one umbrella that were fighting for the same thing. And the convention adjourned on the 20th, and this was the first that have. And the next year they got together, but at this point they have people that are really to spread the word. And that's where we see the founding of socialism in Wisconsin. But first, what I want to talk about is, how do we go back there, is colonization socialism versus practical socialism. So it breaks down into two different camps, for lack of a better word. And this was a real sticking point in the founding of the initial party. So colonization socialism is essentially, you're working to create a utopian socialist colony. And this was to occur in populations that were very light, so it wouldn't have happened on the East Coast, in the higher populations of the Midwest and the Plains. It was to happen more in like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, places like that, that you didn't have these big established cities yet. And within this colony, the whole idea was to gain control of the state government. So again, through elections, through this democratic process, they wanted to elect leaders to the government and begin to gain control. So if you could gain control of your little area, you can gain control of your state, you can then take that step into the federal government. So obviously, we didn't see that happen, didn't work out, but that was the big sticking point. And one of the main differences between Debs and Berger is this idea of colonization. So Debs was of the strong belief of colonization, where Berger was of a very strong belief of practical socialism, or what we now know here as sewer socialism. So this practical socialism really argued for the advancement of socialists through the democratic process, which is kind of I know I keep saying it over and over, but that's really what their beliefs lied in. And it was in the communities that they currently lived in that they were supposed to create this change out of. And it was through that advocation of socialism, electing their leaders, that socialists would be able to gain that foothold that they were seeking to gain. So again, you gain your city, you gain your state, and then you can elect leaders to the federal government, which did happen. Obviously never enough that created any sort of real change, but practical socialism in that respect worked better than the colonization socialism. And so when the initial convention wrapped up, a majority of the socialists at the time decided that colonization socialism was the way to go. It was a majority vote, but the members from Wisconsin and even from other states, because socialism throughout the Midwest, it was kind of everywhere at the time, they decided that that wasn't for them. They stayed within the party, but they were going to do things their own way. And that's where we see the establishment of socialism in Wisconsin. And so 1898, the first branch was established in Milwaukee. Berger was from Milwaukee. He's going to establish it in what has become his hometown. And with this, he wanted to challenge monopolistic corporations and the wealth of a few over the workers. So he, like I said, established the first one in Milwaukee, and it wasn't very slowly, it was fairly quickly that it spread. It spread throughout Milwaukee, and then it started to spread further throughout the state. So there were socialist parties here, obviously in Sheboygan, Milwaukee, Manitowoc, Beloit. I'm trying to think, I mean, they were pretty much throughout the whole state. They didn't have a strong foothold everywhere, but there were parties throughout the entire state. And the whole idea, again, was to focus on this good government ideal and working to solve social and environmental ills for citizens. And one of the big things was updating the sewer systems. So you have these sewer systems that are just old, they haven't been updated, you're getting poor sanitation, you know, why wouldn't you want to make that better for your people? Because you're going to help to increase healthiness and better, you know, cleaner water, cleaner streets, cleaner sidewalks, cleaner homes, everything like that. So with that, since the focus kind of was on sewers, the term was established. And it wasn't established here. It was established by a New York-based socialist. His name was Morris Hillquit, and this was coined in 1930. A little bit later, but he was the New York-based chairman of the National Socialist Party at the time. And he basically said, you know, I'm a common garden variety socialist, but these people really show how much they want to make these changes for the betterment of their citizens. And because specifically Daniel Hone of Milwaukee with the sewers, that's where that term comes from, because Daniel Hone was still mayor at this time in 1932. And so to kind of build upon that, we see the election of 2 socialist aldermen in Sheboygan. So Sheboygan was the first city in the state to elect socialists to any sort of government position. And then in 1904, again, we elected the first socialist mayor in the state. And in 1912, that's where we kind of see the party hit its zenith. So they've hit its height, and it's only going to go downhill from there. So let's talk about Charles Bourne. So he was the first socialist mayor of the city, and he was elected in 1904, and at that time he beat out both the Republican and the Democratic candidates by 1,707 votes. So it's important to note he had previously been mayor, and he was elected in 1895, 97, and 99, and then he took some time off, lost re-election, and came back as candidate. And during that initial run, he was part of the Republican Party, and he was extremely popular. He was well liked in the city, and in 1897, he actually was named the nominee for the Republican, the Democratic, or the third for the Democratic, Republican Party, and the People's Party, which was the Populists. He was named, both of those parties' candidates came in third for the Democratic nomination. So basically, every political party wanted him to be mayor. And he decided that after he lost his re-election in 99, that he wanted to join the Socialists. New party, new chance, why not? You know, and he advocated a lot of what they were pushing for, municipal water utility ownership. He wanted, he really argued that all utilities should be municipally owned. So power plants, water, he was pushing for really that, sorry. So when he was elected, he started to follow through, and he was appointing people to positions throughout the city. And where the Socialist Party broke from him is they said, they accused him of putting capitalists into these different positions. So, of course, that goes against what any of the members of the Socialist Party wanted. They wanted their own members to join in the different positions within the city. And so a few members of the Sheboygan Party, charged him, and the local party decided to not follow through, because there were quite a few of them that had been placed in different positions. They didn't want to lose those positions. They didn't want to lose the favor of the people. So really, it was done at the city level. So then those few socialists of Sheboygan took these charges to the state and to the state party. So the state party heard all the arguments, and they waited. They had to sit. It was January, so it was cold. You're not going to be you're not traveling in your warm car with your heated seats and hot air. It's cold. So they had to wait a few weeks until everyone could get in, hear all the arguments, and decide what they wanted to do with Bourne. Well, the state party decided to charge him, to say, hey, we need you to resign. You don't uphold our values. We want you out. And at this time, too, the Socialist Party actually had a standard of, if you were elected under the ticket, you pre-signed a resignation. So it didn't matter what position. You signed this resignation saying, basically, I have not upheld these principles, I resign. And, well, they screwed up. They didn't have Charles Bourne sign this resignation. So there was nothing they could do. I mean, the state party violated our principles, but the Sheboygan Socialists couldn't do anything about it. So all they did was literally make life, I don't want to use the word I want to use, it made life very difficult for Charles Bourne during the remainder of his term. And so they just kind of pushed him aside. They started saying, we want all these different things. One of the new platforms was free lunches for school kids, and they decided, okay, next election, we're gonna put up our own candidate, and that's what they did. And so the Socialists had Bourne, who they weren't really supporting. They had another candidate, and then there was a fusion candidate. So fusion candidates they were a way for the Democrats and Republicans to come together and defeat the Socialists. So if they wanted to defeat someone, they would come together, because if you run two separate candidates as a Democrat and a Republican, you're splitting that vote. So there's a very real possibility the Socialists are still going to win. So if we want to keep that third party out, we need to come together. And that's who won. And so then Charles Bourne, losing his re-election bid, kind of sat for a few days, and then he rejoined the Republican Party and kind of wrote out the rest of his life. He did work I believe he was also an alderman at a little bit later. But he was the first mayor. Didn't work out so well, but the next one that we'll talk about worked out quite a bit better. So Emil Seidel, the first socialist mayor of Milwaukee, he began in the Socialist Labor Party, and after meeting Berger, he really began to shift his allegiance and joined the Socialist Party of America. And he served as an alderman in Milwaukee, and in 1910, he was elected mayor. Yeah. That's fine. Yeah. No. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. No worries. No, thank you.
All right, I'm gonna have us reconvene here. We were talking in the back. I feel that I should tell you, we are not going to have tremendous this year. We had like 100 Christmas trees all decorated last year in our buildings. We are not having that again this year. We do not have the volunteer staff to support it. Everybody's dealing with some health issues, so we just determined that it was not going to happen. So I don't know that it's been written or posted anywhere, but now you guys know, so pass that along for us if you can. And I'll give Tracie back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, real quick, I want to talk about Emil Seidel. And like I said, he was elected in 1910 in Milwaukee. So the first person elected to a big city as a mayor. And is that good can you hear me? I can try to talk louder too. So he was, in 1911, he was the first mayor in any city to establish a workers' compensation program. He went ahead and established adult and worker continuing education courses, and he established free medical and dental examinations for school children in the city of Milwaukee. So he was able to slowly begin to set up some of these programs that were being touted by the Socialist Party. And he never functioned with a socialist majority on the city council. So he was able to get these things through, and actually those adult worker and education continuing courses, that still exists as Milwaukee Area Technical College. So there's still that legacy going on in the city to this day. And within his administration, he also addressed election reform, minimum wage, unemployment, housing, city planning, a lot of different things that he and the socialists wanted to see happen at the time. And unfortunately for him and for the city at that time, he only served one term. So he was defeated in 1912 by a fusion candidate, which I had talked about a little bit earlier, by a fusion candidate put together by the Democrats and the Republicans. And it didn't sway him too much, because he was then chosen as the running mate for Eugene Debs for the 1912 presidential election. And obviously, they didn't win. Woodrow Wilson won. He became the president in 1912. Debs came in fourth behind Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and they actually, in 1912, the socialist ticket received the most votes that they had ever received. They received about 900,000 popular votes, which for technically a third party at that point, I mean, you could argue the Progressive Party was a third party, the Bull Moose Party, but it was still within the vestiges of the Republican Party. So for a third party, he did pretty darn well, especially for an ideology that isn't necessarily well understood, well known at that time. So moving on, there's not much to talk about with the 1912 election unless we want to talk about Woodrow Wilson, and you don't want me to do that, trust me. So let's talk about Daniel Hone. And I'm sure if you've been to Milwaukee, you've seen or you've heard of the Hone Bridge that goes over the river into the lake down on 794. And he was elected as city attorney as a socialist in 1910. So he came in when Seidel came in to Milwaukee city government. And at the time, Hone worked to lower the prices and get better service for the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company. And he gained such a popular following with his changes that he was seeking to make that he was re-elected in 1914 as city attorney. And then in 1916, he accepted the nomination, socialist nomination for mayor, and won 7 consecutive terms. So his final term, he wasn't technically a socialist. He had started his own party, but he was still really he was continuing to do what he was doing.
What did he call his own party?
It was the Farmers, did I write it down? I saw it the other day. It was the Farmers Alliance Party, I want to say. It was something like that. But yeah, like I said, he was essentially a socialist in all but name at that point. And for him, what he did in his first two terms, it really focused on World War I. So 1916, we entered the war in 1917. You know, what are you going to do? Socialists are pacifists. They saw this as capitalist profiteers putting the working classes against each other in this war to fight and create whatever they were fighting for. I mean, we know what World War I was triggered on, and no one really had a clear idea at that time what they were truly fighting for. And so Hone had to walk this tightrope, and he wanted to keep Milwaukee out of the war, wanted to keep, the U.S. from entering, but how do you keep peace within your city? So he meets with Victor Berger, because obviously Victor Berger is kind of like the head honcho. He is the leader of the party in Wisconsin. Everyone else comes in underneath him. And even though the Socialist Party of the US decided, we're going to take a stand, we're not going to support this war, we don't want anything to do with it, Hone still has to make these decisions. So he decides to allow the draft to happen. He becomes the co-chair of the Council of Defense of Milwaukee. And so he is showing his support for the US fighting this war in his own way. He's doing it to keep his city calm and to keep his city under control. Because if you choose to you choose not to support the draft, you choose not to support the Council of Defense, which is the core of home front organization during World War I, you're going to lose everybody. People are not going to be happy. And so by doing this, he was able to make sure he could still follow through on his socialist plans. And one of those was actually arranging for the purchase of truckloads of food. So that way he could ensure and he could set the prices that this food was being sold for. So there would be no profiteering, nobody would go hungry. He wanted to make sure everybody still had what they needed at that time. And in 1920, so after the war, he sold any of the surpluses that the city had at different outlets at different city offices, and that money went back into the government to continue to fund his programs that he was setting up. And so throughout his terms, he really did what he could do. He used his veto pen. Because again, he never really had a socialist majority on his city council. He did what he needed to do in terms of vetoes and pushing things through, getting support, getting the backing of as many people as he could. And to really kind of highlight what socialism is about, this takes us back just a little bit to the beginning when he's running for office. And it's in March 1916, and again, this is from the Elmer Beck book, which I was so kindly told that it's on Google Books. So if you want to take a look at it, go there as well. But Elmer Beck was 11 years old in 1916, and he remembered, or 9, he might have been 9, he remembered going with his father to his first political rally, and it was for Daniel Hone. And he recalls that when Hone took the stage, he had 2 pieces of electrolyzed water piping. And he says, this is the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company. This is how they failed to maintain their tracks. This is what's happening to your water pipes. And that really, because you're showing people what it looks like, it really gets in your head like, oh my gosh, we got to do something about this. Maybe this is the guy that can do something about it. And so I just thought that was really interesting. One, it's a firsthand from Elmer Beck, who passed away 30 years ago. But it's still, it gives you that idea, because you can't go back, you can't be there. But it's neat to hear how it affected him as a young child. And so like I said, Daniel Hone, longest serving Milwaukee mayor at the time, socialist, he was instrumental in so many changes that happened in the city, and then it helped to spread throughout the state. So we see these public health initiatives, so health inspections, public vaccination programs, comprehensive city zoning, the establishment of more parks, and really outlining the Milwaukee park system, which is a huge, it's a bright light on the city. It's a beautiful park system. And just really also in the Depression, he kept the city from defaulting. So, the Depression was a huge drain on world economy. It wasn't just here, it was everywhere. And so many cities were going bankrupt, and because they were running on deficits. You're borrowing money, you're not paying it back, what are you going to do? Well, during his time, Daniel Hone set up a program to actually decrease the deficit. So he balanced the city budget and was able with that to then keep the city from defaulting on anything once the Depression got really bad. And by about 1934, 35, somewhere in there, they started to sell these, what they called baby bonds. So, you hear about war bonds. So it's a way for people to help fund something, and then you get a return on it, usually with interest within a certain amount of years. And in this case, they were smaller bonds that people could buy in. Within 4 years, you'd turn it back in, you'd get your interest and what you paid for the bond, and none of them lost any value, which is impressive because sometimes that doesn't always happen. And they were able to keep running the city. And even with that, he established a work relief program that gave all working families $50 a month, which was huge compared to other states. I think it was like Kansas gave maybe $7. So $50 is a huge amount of money. So this shows, by talking about Daniel Hone and Emil Seidel specifically, it shows what was done in a large city. And what happened in Milwaukee is really what started to seep throughout the state. So now what I'm going to do is shift and talk a little bit about the fights that the Sheboygan Socialists had in the city and what they worked to achieve. So I've got three big points that I found really interesting in my research. And it's the establishment of municipally owned and metered water rates, the push to build a municipally owned county power plant, and the establishment of a county pension program. So first we're going to talk a little bit about water. So nowadays everyone has a water meter on their house. There's a water meter on every building. That's how we're charged. But that wasn't the case at the turn of the 20th century. At that point, it was a flat rate. So this rate was operated and determined by, they call it the Railroad Commission, but it was really something that determined multiple utilities along with the railroads, and it was a state-run organization. And it didn't really take into account people's individuality and their individual use, and you would have people paying for larger buildings when you live in a smaller house, or you don't have water, you're still paying for that. You know, and the socialists saw that as the working classes and the individuals being taken advantage of. And so within this, we see that in 1908, the water company becomes municipally owned in Sheboygan, so it's no longer privately owned, because it had been previously. And even though it's municipally owned, the water rates are still much higher than they needed to be. So this was being talked about for decades, and it really became a hot topic for the Socialist Party here in about the mid-20s. And they're looking at, okay, how can we figure out, how can we get this water rate to be lower? How are we going to get it so that, you're not paying for City Hall's water when you use only a couple of gallons a day or a couple of gallons a week even. So that's the big thing. And even though the city owned it, they had huge profits because of this flat billing. And at the time, the city had to rent their own fire hydrants. So they're still paying for things and still making a ton of money. So one of the points, just kind of to get this, to show you how much money the city was actually profiting. So this is kind of hard to visualize. So 100 cubic feet of water is 748 gallons. So that's a lot of water, right? And if you look at the 1920 census of Sheboygan, it's just under 31,000 people. So if every resident, just taking into account every resident, not taking into account houses, because it's important, but I think just looking at everybody, if you paid 20 cents for every 748 gallons of water, the water company made about $4,300 in profit. So again, that's based on individual citizens, not necessarily households, but it's still gonna be pretty darn high, because you have people that don't have water yet in their homes. So and then that equals about $52,000 yearly. Converting to today's money with inflation is over $800,000 per year. So this fight to get metered water for residents is really important. And got some more pictures that I borrowed from the research center. And this is what people, what one of their big things was. So when the city broke from having privately owned water, they wanted to make sure that they had someone on the seat and the committee, so they always had ears on what was going on with the fight for metered water. And Fred Nevers, which is, I'm sure, a name that most people know. What's that? Knevers. Thank you. So, Knevers. Sorry, I'm used to the K being silent.
Typically, yes.
Yeah. So, it's a fairly well-known name, and plus wrote the Sheboygan Socialist book, which is very important and instrumental and was great for research. And so he served on the board, and at one point in the early 20s, 1922, he became a member of the board for water commissioners, which was tracking all of this stuff. And by 1926, he served as interim chairman, and he became president of the water department in 1932. So one of the things to note with this water fight is that, and I know I said it just before, but it went on for decades. And I was looking through some city records that I requested from the city clerk in Sheboygan, and there was a movement in March of 1926 to put a ballot to the people to say, hey, do you want metered water? Yes or no? Well, the follow-through didn't happen completely until the mid-1930s. So there was, in 1931, there was a planned shift to go ahead and put meters on every building in the city. But it didn't happen until about 1934. So it really it got dragged out much longer than it probably needed to, but again, at that point, I guess we were in the Depression, so it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult. But in the end, all the meters were set up on the buildings, and people were now paying what they were using. So there was no more, me paying for this new subdivision that's coming in 2-3 years. I'm paying for what I'm doing right now, which was a huge fight. And again, taking the means of production, the utilities, out of the hands of a private entity and putting it back into the hands of the people through being municipally owned. And granted, it took a while to get to the ultimate end of that meter, but we got there. And then the second is the power plant. So in the 1930s, we have a new fight on the county level. And the socialists, there were specifically 3 socialist supervisors, Adam Miller, William Hack, and Henry Grube, and they worked their idea was to create this municipally owned county power plant. It was pretty much just after a new power plant had been built for the city, but the idea was to get inexpensive power to other residents throughout the county, because at the time it would be just the people of Sheboygan, the city of Sheboygan, that would get that power. And this idea really kind of came from Manitowoc, because Manitowoc had municipally owned power and light. And in the research that was done by the Socialists, the city of Sheboygan, the residents, paid about 50% more annually for electric street lighting. And from 1923 to 1931, Manitowoc, because it was municipally owned, actually saw net earnings of about $1 million. So using these numbers, it's really easy to see how or why they wanted to make these utilities municipally owned as a way to, again, take and put that back into the hands of the people. And so another point that they used was to determine how much utilities and taxes generally cost a household in Sheboygan. And if it was suggested that the household paid about $102 a year, and then for utilities, and then about $250 for their taxes. So this utility was, for gas, electric, phone, and they said this is too much money. You shouldn't be spending this much money, even though these are all great conveniences, perfect, just not that much money. And with that too, about 20 cents of each tax bill went to unemployed workers. Because again, at this point, we're in the Depression, people are struggling, we want to give more to the workers. And so the whole idea was, if we establish this county-owned power plant, then we would be able to take some of that money, one, lower your utility costs, two, give some more money back to the people and help them as they needed to survive during the Depression until they could get some sort of work, whether it was through private industry or a federal program.
Excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
Go back to some of your pictures you just had and explain what we're looking at here. Is that Edgewater Power Plant?
So that's the Edgewater Power Plant. And then these are some employees of the power plant in front of their company vehicles. So that's the power plant. That's the Edgewater Power Plant. And then this is some employees of the power plant in front of their company vehicles.
And those previous pictures, where was that first water? Where was that?
That one I think was, I'm blanking. I think it was on the lake shore. Or darn close to it, I believe, yeah.
And the next one is Taylor.
Yep.
Taylor.
Yep, I came across those looking at stuff from the research center, and I just thought it was really neat to see the inside to show that it really was just a water tower as opposed to all the myths we grew up with, or I grew up with.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So here, this is the Socialist Party of the United States, but I thought I didn't really want to show you all another picture of my grandfather, because I didn't think that you necessarily needed that. But I kind of want to just talk about one of the important projects for him, because this is really where, like I said, where this whole research project came from. And so Henry was a county supervisor for about 16 years, and his big thing was working for an old age pension in the county. So prior to that, there was really a pension. It was not something that was because we didn't really think about it at the time. You know, people weren't living as long. Now we have longevity. We saw the creation of the Social Security Act in the 1930s, and that's really what this kind of is. This is a take on Social Security, but this fight also started prior to the passage of that act. And for Henry, his idea was that this pension should be available to elderly, blind, dependent children. You have people, you know, that died in the war, in World War I. You have people that are starving. They're not, you know, there's a lot of things happening in the early 20th century. And so with this, he worked on it the entire time he was with the county supervisors, but didn't really gain momentum until the early 1940s. So it took a while to get to the point where he was able to get the support he needed to establish this pension. And so the first step was the creation of a pension department within the county government, and the establishment of a 3-person committee that consisted of 3 supervisors. And he was on the pension committee, but so on the initial committee, he served as vice chairman in his first year, but by the middle of the decade, he became the chairman. It was his project, so he was elected chairman, and he continued to try to push things through. He wanted to push resolutions through. He wanted to increase the monetary amount. He wanted to increase who could get it. It was really, he called for all medical and dental fees to be billed through this pension through the pension service for those who receive this pension. So it's a similar idea to like Medicare, Medicaid, but obviously different as well.
Is that picture taken where and what year?
This is from the party, the first national convention of the party. So this was in about 1901. I want to say it's from Indiana. So with this pension, it really began to grow and exceed any idea, any thought that Henry had when he came up with it. And so even when the United States Congress passed legislation to establish everything, establish Social Security, establish pensions, Sheboygan County maintained their individual pension, and they continued to increase the amounts that were given to people that needed it, even though their own costs were increasing. And he remained a part of that process up until his death in 1950. And now I've really only looked with this project up until about that point. So I still am expanding on this project to see how a lot of these things that were done at the time have continued forward, and how they've continued forward, because there's still, you know, like I said, especially in Milwaukee, we still have the park system, we still have clean sewers, we have, you know, good sewer sanitation, same in Sheboygan, same process. So it's just, I've kind of looked at it in this kind of little capsule, and I'm working on expanding it from there. And then, so lastly, just a quick kind of recap. So the decline of the Socialist Party really began in 1912. Like I said, that was when they hit their zenith, and then we start to see diminishing returns, especially the entrance of the U.S. into World War I in 1917. There was just, people began to move beyond it. The internal disconnects between that colonization Socialism and the practical socialism also didn't help. I mean, when you, as you know, Abraham Lincoln said, a divided house cannot stand. If you're continuously fighting against each other, there's no way you're going to be able to move forward. You have to work through those problems or split. So they really began to just die off, and you see a lot of socialists beginning to convert to communism. Victor Berger was killed in a streetcar accident in 1929 in Milwaukee. He was hit by a streetcar and somehow lived for another couple of weeks before he passed away. And his wife, Meta Berger, who was also, I didn't talk about here today, but she was also a huge participant in the socialist movement in Milwaukee, converted to communism. And so you see a lot of this going forward. And especially once the two leaders, i.e. Victor Berger and Eugene Debs, are dead, you don't really have anyone that can take the place of either of those men. You have Debs, who's very fiery, you know, very ideological, and then you have Berger, who is able to almost lay the seeds to help convert you to where he wants you to be. So it makes it difficult to continue. And another point with that is that in the 1924 election, we see a major split in the Socialist Party. So you have your own candidate, the Socialists have their own candidate, but the Socialists in Wisconsin decided to back and join Robert La Follette in his final election run. And it was just a way to show, you know, you guys in the Socialist Party are moving a little bit too far to the extremes for us. We're going to backtrack and join with the progressives and try to get our practical sense through. Because La Follette, again, he aligned a lot with socialists. It was just how far was he willing to go? And Debs, of course, he died in 1926. He was very frail. He spent many years in and out of jail. So it really just, that was kind of the death knell for the party at its height. And as I was talking to these ladies earlier, you know, we do still have socialist parties. We do still have a social party at the federal level, but the state level, there's probably something, but not really putting forth any candidates too much because it's not something that they're not going to get a lot of notice. So that's kind of where we are. That's a long and short story of Sewer Socialists, and I want to thank you all for coming out and being here with me this morning and having great questions, and I'm available for any other questions you may have. But thank you very much.
Water to the pumping station picture.
Go back to? Yep.
That one. Okay, I believe that standpipe, those standpipes were on North Point.
Okay, yeah, so on the lake.
This would obviously just
The lake.
Near the lake.